Guys like you don't belong in first class. He said it with a mocking tone, loud enough for everyone around to hear. But just minutes later, a single sentence from Margot froze the entire cabin. It was him, the man judged for his scuffed shoes, who made the whole plane rise to their feet in applause. And the one who insulted him? He could only lower his head, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The man who mocked had just become the punchline in front of an entire cabin. Julian Marks stood in the first-class line, dressed simply, a stark contrast to the luxury around him. A man watched him with disdain, unable to hide his arrogance. What happened next would leave everyone on that plane completely speechless and forever change one life. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The Los Angeles airport was as busy as always, people coming and going, conversations blending together, and luggage rolling in all directions. In the middle of it all, a man stood calmly in the first-class line. That man was Julian Marks. He was dressed simply, a plaid shirt, worn-out jeans, and scuffed boots. He carried a backpack that looked like it had traveled the world with him. There was nothing flashy about him, and perhaps because of that, he went unnoticed. Yet anyone who took a closer look could sense something different about him. It wasn't just the way he dressed, but the calmness he exuded. He seemed like someone who didn't let the chaos around him affect his peace. While everyone else appeared rushed and anxious, Julian stood there, tranquil. He observed everything around him as if soaking in the moment. He didn't mind the glances or the stark contrast between himself and the other passengers. Right behind him in the line was Gregory Blaine. Gregory was the complete opposite of Julian. He wore an expensive suit, polished shoes, and a cologne that demanded attention. Every movement he made seemed rehearsed, as though he wanted the world to know he was someone important. His eyes quickly scanned the line, and when they landed on Julian, he couldn't hold back his comment. "First class, huh?" Gregory said with an ironic smile. "You never know who might show up here these days." Julian turned his head and looked at him, keeping his expression calm. "Yeah, the world is full of surprises." Gregory frowned for a moment. He seemed to expect a bigger reaction, something that would confirm what he thought about the man in front of him. But Julian stayed quiet, as if the comment didn't matter. Gregory decided to push further. "Look, nothing personal, but you don't seem like the type who flies like this," he said, chuckling softly. "It's rare to see someone so casual in first class." The moment to board had arrived. The first-class line began moving forward, and Julian and Gregory, without exchanging any more words, followed with their tickets in hand. Gregory, as usual, walked with firm, confident strides, while Julian seemed oblivious to the commotion around him, walking at the same calm pace as before. When they finally entered the plane, the unexpected happened. Upon reaching his seat, Gregory checked his ticket once more, and as he looked up, saw Julian settling into the seat right next to his. "You've got to be kidding me," Gregory muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. He sat down beside Julian and let out a low chuckle, as if the situation was a joke. Of all the places possible, it had to be here. Julian simply looked at him with that same calm demeanor and gave a slight smile. "Looks like we're traveling together, then," he replied politely. Gregory crossed his arms, trying to hide his discomfort. It wasn't just the fact that he was sitting next to Julian, but the thought that the man he had judged minutes ago was now sharing the same exclusive space as him. He couldn't quite explain why, but Julian's presence unsettled him in a way he couldn't ignore. As the economy class passengers finished boarding, Gregory decided to strike up a conversation, but not in a friendly way. "So, what do you do for a living?" he asked with the casual tone of someone who already thought they knew the answer but wanted confirmation. Julian, who was adjusting his backpack under the seat in front of him, looked up and answered simply, "I work in film." Gregory raised his eyebrows as if surprised. "Oh, I see. Commercials? Small-time stuff?" Julian gave a slight smile and shook his head. "Something like that." Gregory laughed. I've always found it interesting how people try to find their place, you know? But sometimes, certain spaces just aren't meant for everyone. Like first class, for instance. Julian looked at him for a moment, assessing the situation, but maintained his calm demeanor. I think we all have our place, Julian replied. And sometimes it's exactly where we are. Gregory let out a short laugh. That's nice. Kind of philosophical, even. But real life isn't that simple. Julian didn't respond immediately. He just turned back to the window, as if the conversation was over. But Gregory wasn't done yet. You know what? Gregory said, leaning slightly toward him. You might be sitting here, but there are things money can't buy. Some places will never really belong to certain people. This time, Julian didn't respond with words. He simply looked at him for a moment with an expression that combined patience and a certain firmness. It was the kind of look that said more than any words ever could. Gregory, realizing his provocation hadn't had the desired effect, leaned back into his seat with a satisfied smile. He thought he had the upper hand in the situation. But the truth was that things were only just beginning. Gregory was convinced he was in control, but Julian's calmness hid something he couldn't foresee. With every passing minute, what seemed like a simple conversation was turning into something much bigger. With the plane already in the air, the in-flight service began. Margot moved through first class offering drinks, and Gregory made sure to be noticed. A glass of champagne, please, he said with a confident smile. Something that matches the exclusivity of this seat. Margot, accustomed to demanding passengers, nodded with a professional smile. When it was Julian's turn, he made a simple request. Just water, please. Gregory didn't miss the opportunity to comment. He looked at Julian with that same air of superiority and let out a chuckle. Water? He asked, almost laughing. Don't tell me you're going to waste the experience of flying first class with water. Julian took the bottle Margot handed him and replied calmly. I'm fine with this. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Gregory narrowed his eyes as if trying to decipher the answer, but quickly decided to push back. Yeah, I guess that works for people who settle for less. Not everyone is born to enjoy the best life has to offer. Julian raised the bottle and took a small sip, not responding immediately. Other passengers began to notice Gregory's provocative tone, but since Julian appeared unbothered, no one intervened. Maybe the best is different for everyone, Julian finally said with the same calmness as always. Gregory didn't like the answer. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of the conversation. Or maybe people who say that just never had access to what really matters. Some things are beyond the reach of certain people, you know. Margot, who was serving another passenger, cast a discreet glance in their direction as if considering stepping in, but she noticed Julian was handling the situation well. Julian responded with nothing more than a slight smile, turning back to look out the window. Gregory, on the other hand, didn't seem satisfied. He wanted to provoke more, but was beginning to realize that Julian was a difficult opponent to rattle. Gregory was convinced he was winning the dispute, but for the passengers around them, his arrogance was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. While Julian remained calm, Gregory was about to face a reality that would completely change his views on people. Margot returned to the section of the cabin where Julian and Gregory were seated. As she served another round of drinks, Gregory decided to continue the conversation, or rather, his string of provocations. You know, life is like flying first class, he began, gesturing with his champagne glass. You work hard, earn your spot, and then you get to enjoy it. But some people, well, it seems like they're only here because they got lucky. Julian placed his water bottle on the seat tray and finally turned to face Gregory. His gaze was calm, but there was something different in it now, as if he was ready to respond more directly. Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we? Julian said, his tone serene but firm. The passengers around them, who had previously been discreetly observing, began to pay closer attention. The cabin was almost uncomfortably silent. A few exchanged glances, noticing the subtle clash between the two. Gregory smiled, clearly trying to hide that the response had hit him in some way. Well, I wouldn't say that. Some of us are simply on a higher level. Not everyone understands the value of being here. Julian leaned forward slightly, crossing his arms. I think the value of being here, he gestured around the seat, isn't about what you have, but how you treat others. The phrase hung in the air like an undeniable truth. Some passengers nodded slightly, while others exchanged approving glances. Gregory, on the other hand, seemed uncomfortable. He tried to laugh it off, but his nervousness was starting to show. That's a good one. First class, self-help philosophy. Maybe you should consider giving motivational talks, he said, trying to keep his tone sarcastic. Julian simply gave a short smile and turned back to face forward, ending the conversation without saying anything more. His calmness seemed to speak louder than any words. The passengers around them began to react subtly. Some whispered to one another, while others looked at Gregory with disapproving expressions. A couple sitting a few rows behind, who appeared to have recognized Julian, remained silent, respecting his privacy but clearly admiring the way he handled the situation. Gregory, meanwhile, began to notice he was being watched, and not in a positive way. His posture, once so confident, began to shift slightly, but he still wasn't ready to admit he had lost control. Gregory thought he was winning the dispute, but the reactions around him told a different story. He didn't yet know that what was coming next would make him question everything he believed about status, power, and respect. As Margot passed by collecting empty glasses, Gregory seemed determined to win the debate he had started. You know what's funny? Gregory continued. People who have nothing to show for themselves always talk about things like humility and simplicity. Ever noticed that? Julian leaned forward slightly, looking Gregory in the eye. I've noticed that sometimes the people who talk the most about what they have are the ones who feel the emptiest inside. The words hung in the air for a few seconds, and Gregory seemed momentarily stunned, struggling to find a response. He opened his mouth, but couldn't immediately form the right words. Passengers around them exchanged glances, some visibly impressed by the way Julian handled the provocations. Look, I don't mean to be rude, Gregory said finally, recovering, but the world is competitive. If you don't show what you have, people will ignore you. That's just how things work. Julian leaned back in his seat and replied calmly, maybe, but I think true success doesn't need to be shouted about. It speaks for itself. Julian's words seemed to carry weight throughout the cabin. A few passengers nodded discreetly, while others shot disapproving looks at Gregory, who clearly wasn't used to being challenged this way. By this point, the atmosphere in first class had shifted. Many passengers were now fully tuned into the exchange between Julian and Gregory. An older man sitting nearby turned to observe more closely, shaking his head as if to express disapproval of Gregory's behavior. Gregory, aware of the stares, tried to hide his irritation. But instead of backing down, he threw out another jab. Cheap philosophy. It might sound nice, but the real world doesn't work that way. Julian looked at him, still maintaining the same tranquil expression. The real world is made by people, Gregory. And in the end, how we treat others says more about who we are than anything else. Gregory was visibly uncomfortable with the response. He glanced around, noticing that the passengers' attention was no longer in his favor. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared directly at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval. Gregory was beginning to realize that his strategy of dominance wasn't working. He thought he had the upper hand, but the impact of Julian's words was changing the perception of the passengers, and perhaps even his own. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Gregory crossed his arms, trying to mask the discomfort caused by Julian's words. But his irritation was starting to show. Julian, however, seemed unaffected by the atmosphere. He turned directly to Gregory and broke the silence with a calm tone. You know, Gregory, I understand what you're saying. The world can be very competitive. But I've learned that sometimes the need to prove something to others comes from something deeper, an insecurity, an inner struggle. Gregory furrowed his brow, unsure whether this was a provocation or a genuine attempt at conversation. Inner struggle, he said, laughing. I don't know where you got that idea, but you couldn't be more wrong. Julian gave a slight smile and shook his head. Maybe, but I've met many people who thought success was all about what others could see. Deep down, they were just trying to feel something missing inside them. The words hit Gregory in an unexpected way. He fell silent for a moment, fiddling with the wedding band on his finger almost absent-mindedly. But he quickly recovered his defensive tone. That's not me. Everything I've achieved, I worked hard for. And I don't need anyone telling me how to live my life. Julian remained calm, as if carefully choosing his next words. He observed Gregory for a few seconds before continuing. I'm not saying you didn't work hard. I just think that sometimes we get so caught up in the idea of showing off what we've achieved that we forget to look inward. Who are we without all of this? Gregory pressed his lips together, visibly uncomfortable. The question seemed to echo in his mind, but he wasn't ready to admit that it struck a chord. Who are we? He replied with a cynical laugh. We're what we build. Without it, we're nothing. Julian held his gaze, his expression now more serious. I disagree. I think we're defined by what we do for others, not by what we accumulate. And in the end, the things we show the world matter less than what we carry inside. He pointed to his chest, and his words resonated throughout the cabin. Some passengers nodded subtly, while Gregory appeared to struggle to maintain his composure. That's easy for you to say, Gregory said, almost rising from his seat. You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through to get here. Julian responded firmly, but without raising his voice. You're right. I don't know your story, but I don't think I need to know it to see that sometimes, when someone feels the need to shout about what they've achieved, it's because they're trying to hide something. Fear, insecurity, loneliness. The statement hit like a brick. Gregory froze, his face flushed with anger and perhaps shame. He clenched his fists, clearly struggling to contain an outburst. Gregory, finally losing his composure, stood up abruptly, knocking his empty champagne glass to the floor. You think you're better than me? He shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin. Sitting there with your clever little phrases, acting like you know everything about life, but you don't know a thing about what it's like to live in the real world. The passengers fell silent, shocked by Gregory's outburst. Margot quickly approached, trying to diffuse the situation. Julian remained seated, looking at Gregory calmly. He waited for the man to finish speaking before responding. I don't think I'm better than you, he said with a tone that was firm yet gentle. I just think that sometimes we need to stop and think about what really matters. And Gregory, you don't have to prove anything to anyone. The words seemed to strike Gregory deeply. He was breathing heavily, but something in Julian's voice made him sit down again. He averted his gaze, looking more defeated than angry. Gregory sat in silence, Julian's words echoing in his mind. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in front of so many people. But he still didn't know that the worst, or perhaps the best, was yet to come. The flight continued in a heavier silence after the confrontation. Gregory remained in his seat, avoiding looking at Julian. But it was evident he was deeply unsettled. Julian, on the other hand, seemed completely relaxed, as if nothing had happened. A short while later, Margot approached Julian with a polite smile. Her voice caught the attention of the entire cabin. Mr. Marks, the captain asked me to inform you that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his best regards. The name Marks seemed to echo through first class. Some passengers, who until then had been quietly observing, widened their eyes. A murmur began to spread through the cabin, and that's when Gregory froze. Marks, he murmured, almost in disbelief. Julian Marks? Julian nodded politely to Margot and thanked her, not paying much attention to the commotion. He turned to Gregory, who now looked at him as if he were seeing a ghost. "Is something wrong, Gregory?" Julian asked with a slight smile. Gregory opened his mouth but couldn't form a sentence. He looked around, noticing other passengers observing him with curious, and in some cases, disapproving glances. He looked completely lost. Gregory sank into his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He began mumbling a few words, trying to justify his actions. I had no idea. I mean, you didn't say who you were," he finally said. "I didn't know that you were you." Julian kept his tone calm, but there was firmness in his words. "I didn't think it was necessary. I don't usually use my name as a calling card." Gregory remained silent for a moment before attempting to defend himself. "Look, I didn't mean to offend you. I just didn't know who I was talking to." Julian let out a small sigh and leaned forward slightly. "Gregory, what you said doesn't change just because you now know my name. The truth doesn't depend on who you're speaking to. It depends on how you choose to treat people." The words left Gregory speechless. He looked at Julian, then at the other passengers, who now seemed even more attentive to what was unfolding. The humiliation on his face was undeniable. The silence in the cabin was broken by Julian, who decided to conclude the conversation with a final lesson. "You know, Gregory, life is hard enough for everyone. The last thing we need is people trying to put others down to make themselves feel bigger." Gregory nodded slightly, unable to argue. For the first time, he seemed to genuinely reflect on his actions. Julian leaned back in his seat, effectively ending the conversation. Meanwhile, Gregory remained motionless, staring at his hands as if replaying every word in his mind. Gregory wasn't just confronted by Julian, but by reality itself. He began to realize that in his attempt to humiliate someone else, he had revealed more about himself than he ever intended. The rest of the flight was marked by a heavy silence. Gregory, who once seemed like he owned the space, now looked visibly uncomfortable. He could barely meet the eyes of Julian or the other passengers. The arrogance he carried at the start of the journey had disappeared, replaced by something much closer to shame. As the minutes passed, Gregory couldn't stop thinking about Julian's words. Everything he had said seemed so simple, yet at the same time, it struck deeply. Gregory began questioning his own behavior, recalling how many times he had judged people without even trying to know them. Maybe he's right, he murmured to himself without realizing. He glanced at Julian, who was calmly reading a book as if nothing had happened. This only amplified the impact of the situation. Julian hadn't made any effort to prove himself. He had simply let his actions speak for him. As the plane began to prepare for landing, Gregory finally mustered the courage to say something. He turned to Julian, his eyes still lowered, and said, "I need to apologize. Not for what I said just because you're you, but because I was arrogant. I acted like an idiot." Julian looked at him, his expression as tranquil as ever. He waited a moment before responding. "I appreciate the apology. But more than that, I hope you learned from this." Gregory nodded slowly, realizing that those words were an opportunity for change. Then Julian continued, "Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. I hope you figure out what really matters." Gregory remained silent, but Julian's words stayed in his mind. He knew that moment had the potential to change something inside him, if he allowed it. After disembarking, Gregory stood still in the terminal, watching Julian walk away. He saw fans discreetly approach him to greet him and take pictures. Julian greeted each one with patience and a genuine smile, without haste or arrogance. It was evident that his simplicity and kindness came from within. Gregory looked down at his own hands and sighed. He knew he needed to change. Julian's words still echoed in his mind, a reminder that a person's true worth isn't about their status, but about how they choose to treat others. As Julian disappeared into the airport crowd, Gregory felt something new, hope. Maybe that encounter hadn't been a coincidence. Maybe it was a chance to start over. In the end, we all carry choices that shape who we are. Are we living to impress others? or to become better people. Julian's words leave a clear lesson. True success isn't about what you achieve or show off, but about the positive impact you leave on the world and the lives of those around you. So the next time you find yourself in a situation of judgment or conflict, remember, respect and humility never go out of style. And perhaps the change you want to see in the world needs to start with you. Perhaps what makes us truly valuable isn't what we show off, but how we treat others, especially when no one's watching. If this story made you pause and reflect, if some part of you has ever been a Gregory or a Julian, leave a like to help us share more stories that speak to the heart. And don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story might be exactly the reminder you didn't know you needed today.